Greetings. Welcome to the Discerning Truth channel. My name is Tim Morton, but that doesn't mean anything. I'm just a nobody from nowhere. But I'm in a pilgrim's quest to discern Bible truth among the maze of assumption, speculation, and opinion that is widespread in this present world. I'm convinced some of the greatest hindrances to Bible study are the assumptions and presuppositions people insert into the Bible text. I know they hinder me, and for the last several years, my goal has been to try and identify these presumptions and to put them aside as much as I can. With this video, we are starting a series of lessons that will identify a doctrine that I believe is based largely on presumption, speculation, and contrived arguments. The doctrine itself is non-essential and pretty much benign. And concerning one's spiritual life and walk with the Lord, it makes little difference whether one believes it or not. But the study methods used to arrive at the conclusions of this doctrine are consequential and can be quite harmful. Those faulty practices are what we are going to concentrate on this channel and specifically in this series. Now, our basis for truth on this channel is the King James Bible. Some may ask, well, why don't you consult the Hebrew and Greek and constantly quote them like everyone else? Well, there's a simple reason for that, is I don't know Hebrew and Greek. I don't really want to know Hebrew and Greek. I might look at it and consult it a little bit, but I don't know it. I don't know it enough to use it as an authority. And really, I doubt if many of you listening to this know it either. But instead, we will trust that the Lord has given us, English-speaking people, in our own language, the Bible that He wants us to have, and we will use that Bible as our final authority and standard for truth. The topic we're going to discuss in this series is known as the Genesis Gap. And you can probably tell from this illustration what my position is on the Genesis Gap. But what it proposes is that in Genesis chapter 1, between verses 1 and 2, that there is usually a vast amount of time there, and a lot of things happen. There was actually an entire civilization. Some say that there were men there. Others say they were just angels or sons of God. But nevertheless, there was a vast civilization, and then there was a rebellion. Then there was the fall of Lucifer. Then there was the fall of the angels, and then there was a judgment of destruction of water, and then there was a destruction of darkness, and all this, and all that happened in between verses 1 and 2. Now, we'll look at the history of this in just a moment and how it got started. But this idea is been promoted by a lot, especially during the 1900s. A lot of the fundamentalist brethren, a lot of the charismatic brethren, and certain groups have promoted this Genesis Gap to solve a problem that came about in the 1800s. That was originally why it came about. But I'm convinced from studying this in detail in the last 10 years that the Genesis Gap is a position that was developed by reading things into the text instead of what they call exegesis, where you extract truths out of the text. And we believe that will become apparent as we go along. But over the last 20 years, and what's really pushed this matter of the Genesis Gap is over the last 20 years or so, several, especially in the fundamentalist Bible-believing camp, several have insisted on calling it a fact. They will parade around the title, the gap fact, the gap fact. I believe in the gap fact. Well, this change from calling it a theory or a doctrine or an idea or even a position to a fact is significant. It strongly insinuates that those who do not believe it is a fact don't believe Bible facts. I mean, it's obvious. You call something a Bible fact, and then if someone doesn't believe that fact, well, then you're saying they don't believe the Bible. And so, but if it is a fact, facts can be proven. If you're going to call something a fact, you need to be able to prove it from the Bible with the Bible text. And can they? This is what got me started in it. When it was called a theory or an idea, I thought, well, okay, that's interesting. But then when they insisted on calling it a fact, and if you don't believe it, you don't believe Bible facts, well, then that got me digging into it. At first I thought, well, did they find something new? Did they find something that they could be able to prove it with now? Did they find a passage that proves it? And I got into digging around and studying it, and no, they didn't. I think that name is based more on insecurity of certain believers more than anything else. Because of the fact that they can't prove it, but they still want to believe it because it's tied to other doctrines that they have. Well, then they say, well, we're just going to call it a fact to try to bluster their way through. But that won't work to someone that studies the Bible. If it's someone that wants to know the truth, that won't work. You can't force your way through. And also it causes unnecessary division. I mean, why divide people up over this? If something is a fact, well, then prove it. And then it's settled. It's like the resurrection of Christ. Is it a fact? According to the Bible, it is. You can go to passage after passage and prove that he rose from the dead. Simple. You just go there and point to it and say, there it is. Can you do that with the Genesis gap? No, not at all. Not at all. Even some of its most vocal proponents will admit that it is an inferred doctrine. Inferred. So inferences are facts? No, inferences cannot be facts. And if someone insisted that something was just an inference or an opinion is a fact, that makes me question any other thing and doctrine they might propose. I've been familiar with the Genesis gap for about 50 years. And like I said, I took a more serious look at it about 10 years ago because of these gap fact claims. And I'll give you a brief overview of what I found. I found it's built a foundation built on assumption, speculation, contrived arguments, that its proponents must force a private and less intuitive meaning on otherwise clear passages, and there is not one Genesis gap claim or proof text that cannot be more intuitively answered apart from it. And also, I've never encountered a Genesis gap proponent who says that they discovered it by reading or studying the Bible themselves. Everyone, I'm not saying they don't exist, I'm not saying that, but I have researched this extensively, and I have, discussed it with other people, and they all were taught it by someone else. They were taught to see it. Someone opened their eyes to it. And usually it was a respected teacher. I'm not saying it was a bad person. I'm not saying it was a person that was intentionally trying to mislead them. No, not at all. They were usually taught it by a respected teacher, someone they look up to, like a mentor. And since they trust their teacher and they trust their mentor, then they say, well, okay, he says there's a gap, so there must be a gap. That's the way I found that probably, well, really the majority of people that claim to believe the gap, that's why they believe it. Say, well, my pastor says so, or someone I read says so, and they don't really look into it themselves. But the Genesis gap is it's an interesting doctrine. It's an interesting topic, and we're going to spend some time looking at some of the arguments. Now, how it started and the history of the gap, or what we have come to know as the gap now, started in around 1814 by a man named Thomas Chalmers. Now, there's people that will get out there. Some of the gap proponents will say, oh, well, it's found back in the early fathers, some of the ancient writers back in nearly 2,000 years ago mentioned the gap. Well, they mentioned the gap kind of like Nostradamus mentions things, very, very vague and unclear. And none of those people, if they did mention the gap, had all of the things involved with the gap that's in there today, such as the fall of Lucifer and all these other events. In fact, a man named Weston Fields, who wrote a book called Unformed and Unfilled, he said that the first genuine statements of the gap theory were proposed in 1776 and 1791. That's the first ones. So that's not been all that long ago. Now, a man named Thomas Chalmers, he was a divinity professor in the University of Edinburgh, and he's one that made the Genesis gap popular today. And he first lectured on it, like I said, back in 1814. And he says that he figured that there was a gap. He felt compelled to find somewhere to put the new geological claims that science had come up with. You know, they state that they said that they could look at the geology and see all the layers of the sediment and layers of earth and say the earth must be this many million or this, now it's billions. Then it was just millions. But they thought they had infallible proof for that, and this intimidated a lot of the Christians back in those days. They said, well, look, all this science and all this geology, and they're insisting that the earth is ancient. It's more than 6,000 years old. And, how do we account for that? Well, Thomas Chalmers accounted for that by looking and trying to find a place where he could stick all that time. And he found in Genesis, but verse 1, Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, he said, we can stick something in there. And that's basically how it started. It was a doctrine of necessity. Now, here's the peculiar thing about the Genesis gap that I say a lot of the modern proponents don't realize, or if they do know it, they won't say it. But it was considered a liberal doctrine. All the conservatives back then said, I just believe the Bible as it says. We'll date, like Usher, we'll date it back. It goes back to about 6,000 years. It goes back to Adam was created at 404 BC or 4004 BC and all that. And that was the conservative view. The liberal view was the view of the gap. So, well, we got to account for this somehow. So let's just find a place somewhere we can stick it. And it was the liberal view for several years, actually several decades. But then a man who was more conservative by the name of George Pember. George Pember wrote a book, and in that book, it's called Earth's Earliest Ages. You can find it on the internet anywhere. And he is the one that made it popular and more like it is today. He's the one that put the fall of Lucifer in there, the fall of the angels. He put all the fossils in there too, and all the geological ages. He left that. And he wrote that book, Earth's Earliest Ages, and made it a little more mainstream for the conservative believers. And more and more conservatives began to pick it up. And the most notable, of course, was C.I. Scofield in his Scofield Reference Bible. He picked it up, and it came out in 1917, and he mentions the gap. But also, he says that the gap was there. I mean, one of the reasons it was there was it could account for all the fossils and the dinosaurs and all of that and all the early ages which they believed and insisted that exist. And, of course, others, after Scofield, you had Clarence Larkin. He mentions it in his book, Dispensational Truth. You had Harry Rimmer and Schaeffer and Pink and others. They became gap believers, gap proponents. It became a fad. It became fundamental. It became conservative from its liberal origins. And then, of course, it come up even later. They picked it up in a lot of the fundamentalists and Bible believers of the mid-20th century, like Peter Ruckman and others. They picked it up. In fact, Peter Ruckman, in his commentary, he also was at that time allowing for the gap to accommodate the so-called geological ages. He says in his Genesis commentary that the gap could be a good 4 million years. But then later on in his newsletter, he'd say, oh, well, maybe it would just be a few hundred years, maybe 1,200 years. From 4 million to a few hundred years is a big jump. Maybe just a little bit longer, they won't have a gap at all. There'll be 0 years. But anyway, I think the reason for that radical change from insisting that, the gap was necessary because of the geological ages and then they changed it to say, well, it could only be a few hundred years, which will not account for any geological ages. Is, I think the allowing millions and billions of years put the Bible believers and fundamentalists in a what it looked like agreement with evolutionists. And at least concerning the time span, it made them agree with the evolutionists. And though, all the Bible-believing Gappists that I know of, they deny evolution, the Bible believers felt that this apparent association with the evolutionists was too close for comfort. So they tried to distance themselves. And then with the advent of young earth creationism with Henry Morse back in the 50s and 60s, they realized, maybe we just don't have to account for all these geological ages like they used to think that we had to account for. I'm not saying that they're all young earth creationists. I'm not saying it all. I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong on young earth creationism. But that was another reason. They said, hey, there's people that are scientists are saying this geological thing is just a invention. And then the fundamentalist Gappists believe in a literal 6-day creation. They all believe that there are, actually, let me rephrase that. They believe in a 6-day recreation. We'll get into that later. But most will admit that man has only been around for about 6,000 years. And that still puts them at odds with science, so-called. Science say, well, man's been around for hundreds of thousands of years. He evolved from lower species, from apes and so forth. Why would people who believe in the gap insist that there must be a gap to accommodate geology and then completely destroy that appeal or trying to cater to science by saying that man was originally created 6,000 years ago? It was an inconsistency there. So that's why I believe a lot of the fundamentalists and the Bible-believing people in the Bible-believing movement have abandoned the millions or billions of years and just went to 100 years or a few dozen years or 15 minutes. I don't know. But anyway, the Genesis gap is a non-essential belief. It's not a belief that makes any difference, like we mentioned earlier, of your relationship with Jesus Christ, your fellowship with Christ. It has nothing to do with that. In itself, it makes little difference that one holds to it as a theory or not. But a serious issue arises when people insist that it is a settled fact. Facts must be provable. And if not proven, then the hermeneutics of those claiming such is heavily flawed. And so if it's heavily flawed in this area, what about all the other areas and some things they propose? Any system that claims assumption and speculation are fact must be guarded against and identified. In the following, there'll be some relatively brief messages where we're going to examine some of the claims of the gap proponents and see how they are largely baseless and should not be regarded as a fact by any rational person. A theory is one thing, but a fact is another. And each study will be pretty much limited to one particular Genesis gap claim, so people can concentrate on any specific topic of interest. The last study will be a summary and an overview of the entire series, which we recommend all interested in the Genesis gap idea see. If you watch nothing else, you've already watched this first one, if you endured this long. And if you want to see an overview, well, then watch the last one where we'll give a summary and an overview of what the other videos are about. And then if there's any specific Genesis gap claim which we address in any of the other videos, then you can just go watch that one and not necessarily have to watch the others. I did not want to make this into one great big long hour-and-a-half video for people to labor through. I wanted to break it up into small pieces, just a few minutes each, that deal with specific subjects to make it easier to navigate. But anyway, with the next video, we will start.